E.M. Brown, RN retired, CBE, DSC, AFC, and last year he became an honorary fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. I also have a photograph here, which is a fairly recent photograph, which shows you wearing a lot more ribbons than he's got down here. But you're keeping those quiet. Captain Brown was 31 years in the Royal Navy. He's the Fleet Air Arm's most decorated pilot. And he was appointed a test pilot in 1942 as the Chief Naval Test Pilot at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Farnborough. During the 6 years at the RAeS, he commanded the enemy aircraft flight, the high-speed flight, and the aerodynamics flight. Workaholic, I think. Whilst at the RAeS, he made the world's first aircraft carrier landings by a high-performance twin, which was a Mosquito, and by a pure jet aircraft, which was a Vampire. During the Korean War, he served as a test pilot at the US Naval Air Test Center. This is one busy lad. He was appointed in 1957 head of the British Naval Air Mission to Germany. He's got so much overseas recognition. This is just a few of them. Honorary Fellow of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots, Honorary Golden Eagle, US Navy, Master Pilot of Russia. At Charleston in the USA, he was inducted into the US Navy's Carrier Aviation Test Pilot Hall of Honor, the only non-American to have received this honor. At Los Angeles, 2003, the American Society of Experimental Test Pilots, Eric Brown was guest of honor at a celebration of the 100th anniversary of powered flight, attended by 1,500 aviation personalities, including Neil Armstrong and 19 other astronauts. He's been invited to lecture a record 7 times at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. World records. He's flown a world record, and I still can't get my head around this number. A world record 487 basic types of aircraft. He made a world record 2,407 aircraft carrier landings in fixed-wing aircraft. He made a world record 2,721 catapult launches on sea and land. And he still walks upright. And on top of all this, he's even found time to write 10 aviation books. I hesitate to think what he does in his spare time. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Eric Brown.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear all right at the back? Yeah. Good. It's always an honour to come here. I think this is my 3rd time, and I enjoy it every time. And of course, Cosford has a particular attraction for me because it's just stuffed full of prototype aircraft, which for a test pilot is heaven. And I see that there are great plans here for the future. So I look forward, perhaps, to, if I live long enough, to come here again sometime. Anyway, let's start off with what we're going to talk about this evening. About what, in my opinion, were the golden days of aviation. You may think, why were the days golden during the World War II? But there was more intensive aviation going on at that time than probably any other period in aviation history. RAeS Farnborough was a complete pressure pot during World War II, and we were under intense pressure. It was a 7-day-a-week job. We flew Sundays as well, The 3 years of the war, I never had 1 day's leave, and this is how it was. But I can't say I found it a strain. I loved every minute of it, particularly the fact we were winning the war at the same time. It's always helpful. Anyway, let's talk about the days. I started flying as a, if you like, an embryo test pilot in a unit called the Service Trials Unit in the Navy. In the war, of course, this country's lifeline was our convoys to the United States, bringing food, ammunition, you name it, everything we needed. And these convoys were very subject to attacks by U-boat wolfbacks. And we didn't have enough aircraft carriers to protect them. So Winston Churchill had a brainchild here and decided he would fit cruisers with a fighter and a catapult. And they were shot off. They actually removed the undercarriage from this aircraft, or from all these Hurricanes as they were called, and just to save weight. But they were shot off. You'll see them they're on a cradle here, and there are a battery of rockets at the back. You fire the rockets, and you've 70 feet along here, and you achieve 70 miles an hour. And when it gets there, and you'll see 2 tubes here. Now, at the front of this trolley, there are 2 prongs sticking out, and these tubes are filled with water, and the prongs go into these tubes, doing 70 miles an hour at that stage, and you see the length of these, but that is enough to arrest the aircraft, and it is shot off the trolley. Now, one of my first jobs when I came to RAE at Farnborough was to upgrade this, and instead of a Hurricane, we decided we'd better have a Spitfire. And I'll show you. There's the same thing. You see the trolley, and the rockets have fired, and it's just reached the tubes, and you see the spray of water as the aircraft goes off. Well, we were going to have the great man himself, Winston Churchill, come and see the Spitfire being shot off from his great ideas. And on the day there was a lot of excitement, of course, and the guy who filled the tubes was having a bad day at the office. And this is what happened. He either missed the tubes with the water hose or he forgot about them. But you'll never believe it, his name was Murphy. Quite a character. Now the funny thing is, I had to have full power on and go around the airfield till this thing fell off. And you see there's not much distance, there's a lag sitting here. And Winston Churchill thought it was all the normal thing. No comment from him at all. Delighted to see it. But there we are. Now, as a naval pilot, the chairman mentioned it, one of the other things, more interesting jobs I had, was to be asked to put a mosquito on an aircraft carrier. Now this, on paper, looked pretty impossible, because if you look at the pilot's notes for the mosquito, it tells you that the stalling speed, with everything down for landing, is 110 miles an hour. And when the boffins worked out whether the arrestor gear could accept this on an aircraft carrier, they said, oh yes, but your maximum speed when you hit the gear has got to be 83 miles an hour. Now there's something wrong when you can land at 83 miles an hour when the stalling speed's 110. But we worked it out that if normally you land a mosquito at 125 miles an hour on an airfield. And at about I suppose, -2 boost on the engines, just giving them a fair tick over. But by experimenting, we found out if I flew this with +4 pounds of boost on, and that's a lot of engine power on, you could actually hang on the props, get lift from the props, and be hanging on them when you came into land. And I'll show you what actually took place. That's the actual landing. And don't worry about the histrionics from that guy with the bats. They all love to rush around batsmen and make a nanny of themselves. But this, you can see, well, I was told 83 miles an hour was the max touchdown, and I've actually managed to get it down to 78 miles an hour. The difficulty, of course, with this was, at that speed, and with that amount of engine boost on, if one engine fails, that's it. I mean, the aircraft inverts itself in a second and a half. And, of course, you're into the sea before you know what's happened. And furthermore, these were experimental propellers and could not be feathered. So if you had even an engine failure in normal flight, you had a little bit of a problem. But the whole thing was in the aid of an operation which is going to be somewhat similar to the dam busters operation. These mosquitoes were to be taken out to Australia, and an operation called Highball was to send 27 of them carrying the Barnes-Wallis bouncing bomb. Not the same bomb as the dam busters, because that had the shape of an oil drum, really, spinning oil drum. But the mosquito bouncing bomb was actually totally spherical. And they were going to attack Japanese battleships which were in harbour. And they were worked up and ready to go. They'd just got the all clear to go when the atom bomb was dropped at Hiroshima and at Nagasaki, and the war was over. So it never occurred. But nevertheless, so that remains as the only mosquito landing that has ever been done. But these were RAF boys, so don't ask me how they were going to get used to what nonsenses the Fleet Air Arm got up to, but there we are. I suppose they were quite prepared to bust airplanes as long as they could get back. The whole concept was really based on, you remember Jimmy Doolittle, the American, took 16 Mitchells, B-26 Mitchells, onto the US carrier Hornet, and he flew them off in a token raid against Tokyo. This was in 1942, 18th of April 1942. But it was a one-way trip. They had no way the Mitchells could be landing back on a carrier. And all these fellows knew that after they dropped their token amount of bombs, a very small amount, they had to find their way to either Russia, China, or wherever. So it was a fairly spectacular, but only real value in the whole raid was a propaganda value, really. But this was a very interesting operation because this is the heaviest aircraft, twice the weight of any aircraft we'd previously landed on an aircraft carrier. We took it up with a full bomb load on these trials up to 20,000 pounds. So it was quite a... And of course there were many who argued, you can see the hook just hanging down here. Many argued that this was a wooden airplane, and when the hook picked up the arrestor gear, the shock of the deceleration would pull the thing in two pieces. So I had lots of happy thoughts to have there. Might break in two. If the engine stopped, I would turn upside down. Yeah, it sends you to sleep beautifully at night. Anyway, one of the most important jobs we were doing, I would say by far the most important at Farnborough in the war years, was transonic testing. Now, you realise that a piston engine aircraft can never go supersonic because of the drag of the propeller. But when you're fighting an enemy, you always want to have a margin of performance over their aircraft. And the idea was to get to as high a Mach number as possible. Now, for the ladies, in case they don't know, Mach 1 is the speed of sound. So if you talk about Mach 0.75, that's 3/4 of the speed of sound, and so on. So it's all got to be below 1 if it's piston engine. And what caused the whole situation in the European war to change was this. The B-17 Flying Fortress, that projected the war in Europe from an altitude, we were fighting at altitudes of 15 to 20,000 feet, normally speaking. Suddenly, this aeroplane projected the war up to 30,000 feet. So it was a new ball game. And they at first thought that these aircraft could look after themselves. They were very heavily defended, a lot of guns, and they had a theory that if they all stuck in close formation, they would have the firepower to survive. I'm afraid this didn't work out at all. And the first raid they made like this was against Schweinfurt, the ball bearing works in Germany, and they took 600 forts and lost 60. Now you cannot afford a loss rate like that, because in each of these aircraft there are 10 men. So you lose 60 aircraft, 600 men gone. And they thought about it and decided that it was just a bit of bad luck. So this happened in August 1943. So they decided to make another raid against Schweinfurt under the same basis in October 1943. Same numbers of aircraft, same target. Unfortunately, same result. Magic figure of 60 is quite coincidental. There were 60 on each occasion lost. Again, another 600 men. Quite unsustainable. So, it was decided they must have escort fighters. And they introduced as their first fighter the Lockheed Lightning. Now, we had captured 2 German types of aircraft, fighter aircraft, that had landed inadvertently or crash landed in this country, namely the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. And in our tests, we knew that these aircraft could fight at a Mach number of 0.75. Now that is called the tactical Mach number, the Mach number at which you can fight, the maximum at which you can fight. There's a tactical Mach number and a critical Mach number. The critical Mach number is the one which is well beyond the tactical one, and it's the one at which, if you get that far, you have lost control of the aircraft. And the Lightning was taken first as one of the escorts. Secondly, they had this aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolt, and neither of these two were a success at all. And Jimmy Doolittle, same one that was involved in this raid to Turkey, was then the boss of the fighter units in the 8th United States Army Air Force. And he came to Farnborough and he said, I'm getting very disconcerting reports from the tail gunners in my fortresses that when these lightnings and thunderbolts, which were acting as top cover for the forts, flying 2,000 feet above them, so that if the forts were attacked, they could dive down on the enemy fighters, and the advantage of height. And he said they're diving down towards the Germans, but just passing them and going straight on. That's the last we see them. They're disappearing into oblivion. Sad fact was they were making big holes in the ground in Germany. And what was going on? Why were they all disappearing like this? And he sent a lightning and a thunderbolt to Farnborough, and we tested them out. Now remember, the Germans could fight at Mach 0.75. The lightning had a tactical Mach number of 0.68. Useless. The thunderbolt had a tactical Mach number of 0.71. Again, useless. And we had to tell these sad facts to the Americans, and they withdrew the lightnings from this escort duty and made them, or put them in Europe, that's to say, on reconnaissance work. Now you may wonder at this, because the lightning distinguished itself in the Far East. Indeed, the top two American aces in the whole war were flying lightnings in the Far East. What was the difference? The difference was simple as this. The fight in Europe was taking place at 30,000 feet. The fight in the Far East never got much above 15,000. So, because it was mainly a carrier battle going on. So that is the big difference. So there we are, and Doolittle realized that neither of his fighters were any good. The Thunderbolt was very good at ground attack, and they was withdrawn into that role. So what was going to solve the problem? Well, at that time, the problem was solved by this wonderful aircraft, the Mustang. Now, the P-51, the Mustang, was unusual in the fact that it had a laminar flow wing, very, very thin wing, as you can see. And of course, that is the clue to getting higher speed. It also, at first, when it came out, had a rather useless engine in the American Allison engine, which was no good at high altitude. So, Britain saved it by re-engineering it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, and converted what was a very mediocre fighter into one of the best fighters in World War II. Certainly the best escort fighter. Now, it had a tactical Mach number of 0.78, above the 0.75 of the Germans. Now, you may think, oh, you told them all these, we told them what the tactical Mach numbers and whatnot is, but that was no use to the Americans, because in World War II, throughout the war, not a single Allied fighter ever had a Mach meter fitted in it. Mach meters were only fitted in experimental test aircraft. So what we had to do, in the cockpits, the Americans and our people had a list of speed against height. So we'd tell them when not to exceed that. Of course, that's a fat lot of use. If you've got a German up your tail and in the middle of a combat up there, you're not going to sit and look at your chart and say, oh, I'm at so-and-so a height and so-and-so a speed. You know, I've got a trouble here, haven't I? No, it's no good. So we had to tell them what the characteristics were in flight, that they would feel in the airplane that would tell them they are approaching trouble and better get out of it fast. So that was the job we had to do. Now, our own Spitfire was superior to all these. It had a tactical Mach number of 0.80. Now, normally speaking, roughly speaking, the difference between your tactical Mach number and your critical Mach number was about 0.02. For example, if you had the Germans had a tactical Mach number of 0.75, that critical Mach number is about 0.77. Spitfire, however, though it had a tactical Mach number of 0.8, had a critical Mach number as could go any height depending on the strength of the pilot pulling on the stick. And we at Farnborough did an experiment on this, and this was a Spitfire PR-11, and it was in aeroflight, which was my boss. I became CEO of aeroflight, but he was my predecessor, and he was flying this Spitfire 11. He dived it from 45,000 feet down to 28,000 feet. Now, he was a huge man. He weighed 17 stone, he was 6 feet 2, and he could pull a good 100 pounds on the stick. My limit was about 65 pounds. And at 28,000 pounds, he started to try and pull out, and as he pulled on the stick, there was a colossal bang, and away went the propeller, and most of the reduction gear with it, all missing there, as you see. And because these came off, the centre of gravity walked out in the pole at the tail, really. And he came out at 11G. Now, this is recorded. This was fully instrumented, this airplane. And as you know, the top G that the Spitfire is supposed to break up at is 10G. And here we actually recorded 11. And when he came to, of course he was blacked out, the shutters came down, and he found himself up at about, back up at 42,000 feet. And without a propeller and covered in oil. But he got his wits together and said to us that he reckoned if he could work the emergency gear on the undercarriage, he could land the aircraft back at Farnborough, which indeed he did. And I ran out to meet him, and here's the astonishing thing. Unfortunately, on this picture you can't see, but right where the wing meets the fuselage, at the root of the wing, to my utter astonishment, there was a gap of 3 inches at both wings. In other words, he had slightly swept the wings back. And that Mach number he attained in that dive was 0.92. Unbelievable, really. And that is, to this day, the highest speed ever attained in any piston-engined aircraft. That was on the 27th of April, 1944. Quite remarkable effort, really. I could never have got to that speed. I managed to get to 0.88 with what I could pull, but to get to 92 is quite incredible. Right, now let's move on and see where we're going now. That's another shot of there. Oh, I think I'm going back. That's what's happening, yeah. Now, you may remember, or some of you will, in the summer of 1944, for about 6 months, we were subjected to a rain of V1, German V1 missiles sent this country, which was unmanned piloted bomb. And they came over usually at 1,000 to 2,000 feet. Although in fact they could go as high as 10,000, but normally it was 1,000 to 2,000. At a very steady speed of about 400 miles an hour. And when they ran out of fuel, then the bomb died. It was there was no attempt to pinpoint a target. It was just headed towards London in general. Now, we were going to have to do something to combat this, and the RAF didn't have an airplane which, at those levels, 1,000, 2,000 feet, could do more than 400 miles an hour. So we had to do something very drastic. And we took 3 aircraft, the Tempest 5, the Spitfire 14, and the Mustang 4. And we boosted up the engines by using 150 octane aromatic fuel. And of course this was a big strain on the engine, and it was only allowed to run at these speeds for 5 minutes. And then after that had to have a very good check. And before we released them to service, I was doing the trials in this Tempest 5, which of the 3 aircraft was the most successful, in the sense that it knocked down 638 V1s out of the total 1771 V1s that the RAF shot down. So it was very successful. And by using this, we got it up to 405 miles an hour. Well, when I was doing the trials, I was told to start at 1,000, 2,000, and then work up to 7,000 feet. And I was at 7,000, and of course I'd done runs of all these things at 5 minutes each, so the engine had taken a bit of a caning. And at 7,000, there was suddenly a colossal bang, and everything stopped. And I thought, well, I can glide down and get it, and maybe dump it down some field. But unfortunately, what changed my mind was I found the soles of my feet were burning, and the engine was on fire. So I bailed out at about 1,500 feet. There was no trouble getting out of it. I turned it over and let myself drop out. But what I didn't know was what I had let myself in for, because I was very concerned that when it came down it might hit me, because it was we were going down very close together. And I spent so much time looking up, seeing where it was, that I got a bit of a shock when I finally arrived on Earth, which was in a duck pond. And a very slimy duck pond, I may say. Anyway, I was fine. I got there. It was only about waist deep. Gathered up my parachute and waded towards, as the Navy would say, towards the nearest shore. And when I got there, lo and behold, who was there to greet me but the local bull? And there he was. Oh, he had all the body language. Legs spread out, head down, steam coming out both nostrils, and he had a ring in his nose, rather like a guy with one of these ears these days, you know. Anyway, he had one in his nose, and looking very belligerent. So I thought, well, discretion's the better part of valor. Go to the opposite shore. So I turned about and waded across, but my friend, he had intelligence. He was round there waiting for me. So I thought, oh, I've got a clever bull here. Anyway, I thought, wait a minute, all the forces will be here. Ambulance turned up, fire brigade, police, Dad's army, the lot all showed up. What were they doing? All peering over the hedge. Nobody willing to win a VC in this situation. So I shouted to them, get the farmer. So off somebody went and got the farmer, and the farmer came down, and he, a real son of the soil, waddling down, and he walked straight over this bull, put his 2 fingers through the ring in its nose, and said, come on, Ferdinand. And off the 2 went. And you know, I swear that bull winked at me when it went. I really do. But there we are. Anyway, it was a very successful aircraft, this one. Right, now we're going. Now we're just at this stage entering the jet age. And this is Britain's first jet aircraft, the Gloucester E-2839. It was really a flying test bed for the engine. And Frank Whittle's first engine was installed in this, and it flew for the first time in the 15th of May 1941. But we had it at Farnborough right up to 1944. And I'm flying this on this particular one, just one of the last flights before it was handed over to the Kensington Science Museum. Delightful little easy aeroplane to fly. Now Frank Whittle, I had a lot to do with him because he came down all the time interested in the progress we were making with these tests. And he went for the propulsive system, jet propulsive system, of using centrifugal flow. And that is to say, you have usually one big compressor and your combustion chambers and one big turbine wheel. Now, the Germans went, firstly they went centrifugal flow, but later went to what's called axial flow, and I'll come to this in a minute. But axial flow is slightly more complicated, because you could have 2 or 3 compressors, even 4 or 5 compressors, your combustion chambers, and a whole series of small, instead of one large turbine wheel, whole series of small turbine wheels. And the advantage of centrifugal flow, of axial flow over centrifugal flow is this. As centrifugal flow, as Frank put it, I said to him, why have you gone for centrifugal? Because there are better advantages with axial. And he said, at this stage in the game, we're at the beginning of it, I want to have simplicity and reliability. With axial flow, you have a much more complex engine, and the Germans went that way, and look what happened. Superior engine, but the total scrap life of the German engines was only 25 hours, because they are complex engines. What are the advantages? With axial flow, as Frank said, with centrifugal, simplicity and reliability. With axial, you have a smaller frontal area for a given power, so you have a more streamlined nacelle. And also, you have better fuel consumption. So that's the way the Germans went. Now, we continued with centrifugal flow right up to the Meteor and just beyond. So we weren't going the right way, but eventually we came on to axial. The Germans didn't invent the jet engine. They found out about Whittle's patent for the jet engine, and when he applied for his patent in 1930, it was published by His Majesty's Stationery Office, as was the wont in those days. And the first thing the Germans did was send their embassy officials down and buy about 30 copies and distribute them to major manufacturers throughout Germany. And of course they got the game, and with German money and backing by the Nazi Party, they got way ahead of us, and their jet engines, their jet aircraft were operational before ours. Let me show you. I'll come back to that one in a minute or two. Now that was the first jet aircraft I ever met in Germany. That's the Radio 234. And here are the axial flow engines. You see, these are quite small nacelles for the huge amount of power that they had. This is a reconnaissance bomber, totally unarmed, depending for survival on its speed. And an unusual cockpit, almost like a helicopter cockpit, all glass. The Germans loved greenhouse cockpits. They had lots of them in all their aircraft. And when I found this, it was at a field called Grove in Denmark. And since we knew little about them, because the Germans were very skilled at destroying all their documentation. So we didn't know what the service life of these was, or how much they'd used them, but we did know the scrap life was 25 hours. Anyway, I had a German maintenance team, because we didn't know enough about them, get this ready for flight, and I taxied out of Grove, the end of the runway, opened it up to full power, was just about to release the brakes, when the starboard engine blew completely out of the airframe, taking the starboard wing with it. You look pretty silly sitting on the end of a runway on your left wing, but there we are. And fortunately I hadn't at least moved at all. But it goes to show that there were two possibilities: either sabotage by the crew that was servicing it, which I thought very unlikely, or it had done 24 hours and 50 minutes, which was very likely. And I think we never did find out. But I have to say, subsequent to that, I flew about 300 to 500 hours in German jets and never had another bit of trouble. But they were very sensitive to throttle movement. Now, talking about Mach numbers, that also, like the ME-109 and the 190, had a tactical Mach number of 0.75. So it was a useful airplane. And here was the second operational German aircraft, the ME-262, Messerschmitt 262. This, without any doubt, was the most formidable aircraft of World War II. It had the same engines, axial flow, same as the Arado 234, but swept back wings, 28 degrees of sweep back, and huge armament, 4 30mm cannon. Now this aircraft was at least 100 miles an hour faster than any other thing that was in the air at that time. It was a quantum jump in performance, and a league by itself. But it was so fast there was a problem, because like the British, they hadn't realized that with a jet, we all knew they'd go fast, but we hadn't thought of how you slow them down. And we didn't put dive brakes on our initial jets, nor did they. And when this thing came in to attack a fortress, for example, one has to remember that the guns it had, the 4 30mm cannon, had a poor range. They were inaccurate, above 650 yards. So you had to close to about 600 yards before you opened fire. You're coming in at a colossal speed, and you have no dive brakes to slow down, and you have to break away at about 200 yards or you'll collide with the target. So you have 2 seconds firing time, and not much to get any accuracy. But if you are accurate with 4 30mm cannon, you are going to blast a large hole in anything you hit. It really was, it would have caused us a lot of headaches if the Germans could have continued with them. But there were problems. They were running out of pilots, for the simple reason unlike the RAF, you didn't have a tour of duty, were rested, and maybe had another tour of duty. The Germans, from day one till you dropped dead, you were in the air fighting. The only thing that could relieve you is if you were wounded, and as soon as you were out of hospital and could get back on your feet, you were back in the air again. And of course, they had no place, no hiding place, so to speak, to train their pilots. Whereas we had the Empire training scheme, could train them in America, South Africa, Canada. The Germans had nowhere to go. So they were running out of pilots fast. They were also running out of fuel because we had been consistently bombing the oil refineries. But nevertheless, this, for its day, was quite supreme. Mach numbers, it had a tactical Mach number of 0.83, higher than anything we had, and a critical Mach number of 0.86. So it really was a remarkable airplane. It didn't use kerosene like we did. It used 87 octane petrol and 5% lubricating oil. Now that was a rather nasty, if you had a crash, unlike kerosene, it burned ferociously. So it wasn't very safe. And also in this remarkable airplane, they did not have an ejection seat. Nor did they in the Arado 234. Why? We never know, because the Germans were way ahead of us with ejection seats. We think of Martin Baker as the leader in ejection seat operation. The Germans had their first successful ejection in anger from a jet aircraft in January 1943. Unlike us, they did not use cordite for their seats. They used compressed air. And they initiated them by pulling the blind, like we did, but also they had a thought ahead of us in this sense. They realized that many ejections take place because the aircraft and the pilot are under heavy G. And with such G, you cannot get your hands up to grab the blind because you press down with the G. So they realized this, and down on the pilot's left thigh, they had a trigger which, if you pulled, would eject the seat. So they were well ahead of us in that respect. I'm going back a couple here to show you the airplane I just went over. Up in Grove, in Denmark, where I told you I flew the Arado 234, also found this airplane. A night fighter, the Heinkel 219, which was really the German answer, or they thought it was, to the Mosquito. And there were one or two interesting features about it, but the main one was this was the first production aircraft in the world to have ejection seats. Now you have a pilot sitting here looking forward and a radar operator sitting here looking aft. Both had ejection seats and either one could initiate the ejection. I hope he told his buddy what he was doing. Come with a bit of a shock anyway. Anyway, as if whoever initiated the ejection, the radar operator went first, and he went that way, and 0.3 of a second later, the pilot went that way. And never the twain shall meet, you hope. But remarkable aircraft, really. And it also had another staggering feature. Between the two cockpits here, angled up at an angle of 65 degrees, were two 30mm cannon. And remember, in night fighting, the standard method being used all over the world was Remember in the war, there were aeroplanes about 100 in the sky at night. You never knew whether it was an enemy or your own. So the first thing as a night fighter you had to do was get under the possible target, try and get it silhouetted against the sky, and identify it as an enemy or your own. If it was enemy, you then had to slide back, get up through the slipstream of the aircraft, and then try and shoot him down. All of this took time, difficult, and he may have gone into cloud when he realized he was being attacked. With this aircraft, you only had to get underneath the bomber, identify it, and if it was enemy, just blast off with these two cannons at 65 degrees. To show how effective it was, on the first operational sortie ever made by this aircraft, it shot down in one sortie 6 Lancasters by this method. Extremely good indeed. Right, now we're going to show you, we'll pass the jets again for a minute. Now here was another remarkable German aircraft, the Messerschmitt 163. Rocket powered, swept wings, 23 degrees of sweep. It had no elevators, elevons only on the wings, and it landed on a skid. The trolley there is merely for takeoff. You jettison that on takeoff. Now, this, in my opinion, was a tool of desperation, because the idea was that you flew up the altitude, and remember, this was an era when fighters had a rate of climb of the order of 3,500 feet a minute. Initial rate of climb. This aircraft, under rocket power, had an initial rate of climb of 16,000 feet a minute. And the idea was to get up above the bomber stream, because remember the fortresses were normally about 30,000, get up above it, cut the rocket. You could throttle the rocket in this airplane, cut the rocket, dive down on the bombers, and you had 2 30mm cannon in the nose, fire on them, and when you cut the rocket you had a stopwatch in the aircraft. You had to stop that because you had 2 minutes had to elapse between stopping the rocket and relighting it again. But if you were skilled, you could do as many as 6 attacks before you ran out of rocket fuel. And you then had to glide back to base. So really, it was rather impractical type of aircraft. I only flew it once under rocket power, and I think if you want to know what the feeling was like, I would say it was like being in charge of a runaway train. The nearest I can bring you to it. But it always seemed to me to be a jump ahead of you all the time. And when you got up, climbing, it was such a steep angle of climb, but the order of 45 degrees with the rocket going, you couldn't see the horizon at that angle, so it all had to be done on instruments. And I think the aeroplane probably killed more Germans than ever did Allies, because it had very, very volatile fuels called C-Stoff and T-Stoff. And T-Stoff was concentrated hydrogen peroxide. You can't have a more explosive mixture than that. And C-Stoff was hydrogen hydrate and methanol, also a catalyst for an explosion. And if you landed this thing, you had to have no fuel aboard at all, under no circumstances, not a drop, because if any was aboard and left on touchdown with the bounce and the bang of landing, the whole aircraft would blow up. When you sat in the cockpit, and this is the bit I didn't like, you were in what looked like an armchair, and these were actually fuel tanks around you. And the fuel tanks were of T-stuff, hydrogen peroxide. And if it was hit and overflowed, if a bullet penetrated you, it would melt the pilot. You had a special non-organic suit on, but nevertheless, in spite of that, it was no real protection against hydrogen peroxide. To show how ineffective I think it was, in all its operational career, it only shot down 16 Allied aircraft for the loss of 10 163s. So not a very impressive kill rate. Right, let's move on. There was another German aircraft, the Dornier 335. And, as you see, an engine in front, an engine behind, pusher aircraft at the back, tractor aircraft here. It had 18 degrees of sweep on the wings, and another new feature on it was it had powered controls on the ailerons. Remember, the Allies hadn't got to powered controls in the war, so that was a jump ahead of us again. Also, another innovation, on the front air screw here, you had reverse thrust. As you'll see, the aircraft is very clean, and when it landed, it tended to run a long way. So if you used your reverse thrust, you could reduce the landing run by about 25%. So it was full of innovation, this aircraft. And also, here's an interesting one, it had an ejection seat, and this is how it operated. You had 3 buttons on the right-hand side. When you pressed button 1, it blew off, an explosion bolt blew off the rear propeller. When you pressed button 2, it blew off the fin and rudder. And when you pressed button 3, it armed the seat. Quite a maneuver to go through, and a bit time consuming. But nevertheless, this was the fastest production piston-engined fighter in the world. Twin engine. It's interesting to compare them, because our fastest twin fighter was the de Havilland Hornet, which had a top speed of 472 miles an hour. The Americans had the twin Mustang joined together, you may recollect them. That had a top speed of 470 miles an hour. So the Hornet was 2 miles an hour faster. And this was 474 miles an hour. Just 2 miles between the 2 miles an hour between each of the 3 aircraft. It was in production at the end of the war, but they hadn't had sufficient time to work up an operational squad. Nevertheless, the Germans were full of innovation, no doubt about that. Now let's look at the Japanese aircraft. This is the ubiquitous Zero. And when I flew it, I found it very strange in this sense. There is no bulletproof windscreen. There is no armor round the pilot. There are no self-sealing tanks. And you cannot jettison the hood. The idea was, this is in Japanese philosophy, you fight to the death. You are not meant to save yourself. and it was incredibly light. It had very, very thin gauge skin on the fuselage and on the wings. And I found it slightly disconcerting because when you flew it, all the time there was this crackling noise. I don't know if you ever had a big square biscuit tin and pressed the sides of the biscuit tin and you hear a lovely crackling noise. Well, this was going on all the time on this aircraft. But that was the Japanese philosophy. Now this was a magnificent airplane. Show you it in flight. And for a while it was the top fighter in the world. And then it was the top fighter in the Far East right up to mid-1943 until the Grumman Hellcat arrived. It could outturn anything in the world, this aircraft, any fighter in the world. And in consequence, it tended to fight in the horizontal plane, always in tight turns. It didn't have a very fast diving speed. But when the Hellcat came, it was a much bigger, heavier aircraft and could not deal with the zero in the horizontal plane. So the very, very successful American tactic was to fight in the vertical plane. And by that I mean they always sought to have height superiority, dive down on the zero, which would immediately go into a tight turn, and I knew the Hellcat normally couldn't follow it, but with the speed the Hellcat had picked up in the dive, it could pull enough G round the 1/3 of the whole 360-degree turn to follow the zero, only for a third of the turn, but with 6.5 machine guns against this brittle aeroplane. It was highly successful. And in fact, so successful that although the zero had a kill rate of 12-1 throughout its wartime career, the Hellcat had the highest kill rate of the entire war, of 19-1. So it was a quite remarkable airplane in many ways. And one of the great sagas of the war involved one of the Japanese pilots on a zero. He was called Saburo Sake. And at that time, he was the second highest scoring pilot in Japan. And the Japanese had just lost the island of Guadalcanal to the Americans. And this was a severe blow to them, and they decided at all costs they must get Guadalcanal back. And on the 7th of August 1942, they sent an entire wing of Zeros from the nearest base to Guadalcanal, which was Rabaul. Now that was 640 miles from Guadalcanal. So the Zeros all had drop tanks with them, and they dropped them just as they approached Guadalcanal. And Saburo Sake, in a matter of 5 minutes, shot down. He had already had at that time 56 victories, and he shot down 4 Wildcats, just bang, 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 like that. And he saw what he thought was a 5th Wildcat, and he attacked it, but he made a dreadful mistake, because it was an airplane he had never seen before, called the Grumman Avenger, which was a torpedo bomber, but made by the same company, and had the same look in many ways, but it had a rear turret, rather like the Defiant. And as he came in, the turret opened fire, and he received 2.5-inch bullets in the head. Shattered the windscreen. Remember, it wasn't bulletproof. Wiped the this part of the cockpit away down to about here, and that probably saved him because the fresh air probably kept him going. But when he got these 2 bullets in the head, he was blinded in the right eye and paralyzed in the left arm and the left leg. And he flew the 640 miles back to Rabaul and landed safely, and by that time he had been in the air in a single-seat fighter 8.5 hours. Shows the remarkable range of this thing. And he survived. He only died 2 years ago, and he died and lived to fight another day, and in fact finished up as the top Japanese ace with a total of 64 victories. It's quite a remarkable story, really. Right, how's the time? Are we a bit yet? Okay. I just thought I'd show you the first jet landing on an aircraft carrier, of a jet on an aircraft carrier. They're made in December 1945. And this is a vampire, of course. And one of the problems with this was all early jet aircraft were very slow to accelerate the engine. If you moved the throttle quickly, you could flame out the engine, so you had to move it very slowly, and of course this is no good in an emergency on a carrier. So, in spite of that, it went well, and I'll show you the actual touchdown. And of course, by this time we learned the lesson to have dive brakes. And, well, no, sorry, these are the flaps. They're the dive brakes. But it is essential to have quick acceleration, because the essence of deck landing is lift control. Now, in a piston engine aircraft, you get immediate lift control. When you open the throttle, the prop rolls up and you get lift from the slipstream of the prop. In a jet, the only way you can get lift, because you don't have a prop, is accelerate forward, increase your speed. And if you don't have a quick throttle response, you're in trouble. So we had to leave things until we solved that part of the jet problem. But otherwise, there was no trouble with this at all. There's a thing called the flexible deck landing. In our wisdom, we thought, let's have a system, simplify. Instead of having 10 wires strung along the deck, and you land the deck, pull it up, have a wire 3 feet above the deck and fly through it. Don't try and come in too slowly, just fly through it and pick it up, and you sink into a rubber deck. I'll just show you. There you are. There. I'm just picking up the wire there, just flopping into the deck there. They always hose the deck with water to reduce the coefficient of friction. There it is. Now the great advantage of this was, because there was no undercarriage, the height of the aircraft was considerably lower, and you could actually put twice the number of fighters into the hangar and the carrier's hangar. But of course, the problems were, if you were going to operate this, you had diversions ashore, you had to have rubber decks ashore. So the logistic problem beat it, really. Right, I think that's about it, but I'll see what I've got there. I'll just show you this last one, because this is worth seeing. This is the thing that almost made me Chuck Yeager in Britain. This was our first proposed supersonic aircraft, the Miles M52, which I was to be the pilot of, and basically it's shaped like a .5 bullet, because that goes supersonic, and we had a jettisonable cockpit. The whole cockpit would shot off by explosive bolts if we had any trouble, and I'll show you an idea of how it was to be in flight. It had very thin wings, so thin it was they were biconvex wings. If you take a diamond shape and lay it on its side, that's what they were like. And the leading edge and the trailing edge were so sharp, they were so thin, you could actually cut yourself on. And they were called Gillette wings, after the razor blade. And it also had a wonderful innovation called the flying tail. Instead of having a tailplane and an elevator, they were all one piece. And this gave you the control in the transonic stage that you badly needed. In fact, the Bell X-1, which Jaeger was flying, would never have broken the sound barrier because he was in desperate trouble before that, without us giving them the flying tail. We cancelled this airplane, gave everything to the Americans, handed it to them in a plate. And the deal was, this is what the government believed, give them all the details of the M52, and then they will have a reciprocal visit by us, and we will see all the details that they have on their supersonic research. We got the visit to America was cancelled, and I've had a letter in the last month. One of the ground crew, or the boffins on the X1, who said, yeah, we cancelled the thing because the truth of the matter is we didn't have any information to give you. One has to realize this, we were the foremost country in the world on transonic research. The Americans had done little or nothing. Even the Germans were behind us in this respect. The one thing the Germans were ahead of us was in the wind tunnels they have for research. So we missed the boat on this one. What might have been. Anyway, Mr. Chairman, it's a note to finish on, I think. Thank you for listening so attentively.
I'm a bit worried about that. I think he's going to self-destruct. Oh. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Brown has very kindly offered to take questions.
Captain Brown, can you cast your mind back to when you came to fly the DH-108 after the loss of the first aeroplane? Did you actually, or did the team actually have any target in mind when they set out, or were you just expanding the envelope in the hope that you'd find out what had happened?
Now we had 3 targets in mind, actually. Originally, before Jeffrey was killed on the first one, the 3 targets were break the world speed record, and number 2, go supersonic, and number 3 was just investigate the qualities of a swept wing, virtually tailless aircraft. Now, as you know, Jeffrey was killed on the work up to the world speed record, and I took over the accident investigation, and we found out the reason, but it's one of the most terrifying rides I think I've had. Now, what Jeffrey was doing was, in those days, you had to attempt to break the world speed record below 1,100 feet in height. this was a strange 1100. It's a metric number put into feet. So it was at very low level. And he was working up, taking the DH-108 to full speed, starting at 10,000 feet and coming down at 1,000 foot stages, working down towards it. And he was at 7,000 feet, doing Mach 0.875, when, without any apparent warning, the aircraft totally disintegrated. And we found his body in the mud flats of the Thames estuary. His parachute had not been opened, and his neck was broken. The first assumption was that it was broken with impact with the ground, of course. But the medics found out not so. It had been broken in flight, and that was the reason he had never used the chute. He was unconscious and couldn't use it, and may even have been dead at that stage. So I was told to repeat this and start it again, just exactly but we had done, before I say that, we had done a few modifications. We had strengthened the wings of the aircraft. I had an ejection seat fitted, and I had powered controls on the aircraft. But even so, we started off and we did this. We had a camera fitted in the cockpit and full instrumentation fitted in the rear of the aircraft. And I was moving down, just as Geoffrey did. Remember, he broke up at 7,000 feet at 0.875. And I was down to 4,000 feet at 0.88. Very close to the same figure. When, without any warning, suddenly got a runaway divergent longitudinal oscillation. Now, all that sounds very hairy, but what it means is this, and you can't believe it. This is an airplane doing this. The airplane was literally doing that. 3 cycles a second, and each cycle plus 4G minus 3G. So you're just doing that. And the camera in the cockpit shows my head. I'd been warned that this might happen. So my seat was down to the lowest it could go, and I had a pad behind my head. And remember, we had no bone domes in these days, just leather helmets. And you can see my head, my chin striking my chest, going straight back and striking the pad behind me. And the medics reckon that 10 seconds of this will cause unconsciousness. In fact, after 7 seconds, and I had no knowledge what to do. It was pure instinct. I couldn't reach the ejection seat to pull the blind because of the G that was going on. No hope to get my hand up there. And so I just pulled, I had my hand on the throttle and my hand on the stick, and I pulled them slowly back together for no particular reason, instinct, I suppose. And after 7 seconds, it finished as quick as it happened. So now, what we concluded, and I think from the photos we have, was that the same had happened to Geoffrey. And of course, he didn't have the strengthened wings on his occasion. And he was, unlike me, he was 6'2", and his head, going back and forward like this, had obviously struck the canopy, top of the canopy. And almost certainly that's how he broke his neck. So that's the story of that lot. As to whether we could get supersonic, again I had to go at this. And the highest I got to was 0.985, getting awfully close to it. But at that speed, the stick was on the backstop. There was nothing left. It could not go any faster. Now, you've probably heard tales that John Derry went supersonic in this. Well, I was sent to interview John from the RAE. John was a very honest citizen, and he said, I don't know if I went supersonic because I ran out of camera film and we'll never know. But he said, I think I probably did, but out of control. And of course, if you are going to claim supersonic flight, it has got to be in control. Otherwise, you get many guys claiming it who made big holes in the ground. So that's a very different matter. Yes?
Yeah, Captain Brown. Can you tell me, please, why you have the nickname that you have?
Why am I called Winkle? Yeah. Well, very quickly, I was up at Arbroath in Scotland, and there was a swordfish squadron there, led by a man called, you may have heard of him, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond. And Esmond squadron suddenly got the message they had to go down to Manson at the Toot and try and stop the Scharnhorst and Grenadier now dashing through the channel, torpedo them. Now he was called Winkle Esmond, and I should think we were exactly the same size and height and everything. And when he was killed on that, he won a posthumous VC, as you probably know. The very next day, as if somebody had beat the tom-toms, everybody started calling me Winkle. I thought with a bit of luck this will all die when I leave the Navy, but no. Yes?
It seems clear from your book what your least favourite aircraft was. What was your most favourite?
I have two favourite aircraft, a piston and a jet. My favourite piston engine is the de Havilland Hornet. This is the twin engine. For one simple reason, it was overpowered. And glorious to have an airplane. I used to do an aerobatic show with the Hornet. Used to come in, do a loop, then feather one, do a loop, then feather them both and do a loop. That was the Hornet. Absolutely marvelous. My favourite jet, the Sabre F-86E with the flying tail. You may remember we referred to the flying tail on the ME-52, or the M52. And that was the harmony of control, which was how a pilot judges the handling of an airplane, was superb. You couldn't fault it. It was absolutely wonderful. Or the worst one, easy to absolute horror, called the General Aircraft L-56. It was a swept-wing glider, and when you stalled it, normally you go up and gently and I think dropped away. This one did this. Straight over the back. I flew it 20-odd times and I had to stop flying it because we ran out of flight observers. Nobody would do more than one flight. And I delivered it back to the company, and their test pilot, it's remarkable, a company hands over an airplane to Farnborough and doesn't test it themselves. And he did a flight in it, and he was the very famous glider pilot, and he was killed. Yeah, and the flight he did. Very sad. Yes, you were.
Just very quickly, can you just tell me about your first flight in the Sikorsky R4? Because I believe your instructor was a flight commander.
On the which?
The Sikorsky helicopter, the R4.
Yes. I was at Farnborough at the time, minding my own business, when somebody said there's an aeroplane to collect at Speke in Liverpool. Well, it wasn't an airplane, it was a helicopter. I'd only seen one helicopter before, and it was in Germany, and Hangar Wrights flying it, and it had two things on outriggers there. This one didn't have that. It had one up above and one on the tail. And nobody had told me about this. The others, the CEO of Aeroflight and myself went up because there were two helicopters to collect. And they were being put together, taken out of crates by a big master sergeant in the USAF. And we said to him, where's our instructor? Full of cheer and optimism, you see. And I always remember he handed me a buff-coloured book and he said, there's your instructor, bud. So we went to our sort of Nissen Hut that evening, this chap Martindale and myself, and we sat reading these books, trying to burn up for the next day. And I always remember Martindale turned to me and he said, "Do you know, this is like reading your own obituary." So, anyway, he went out and we both sat in these things and revved them up. And I told you, it's the same guy that did that .92 in the thing. And he was 17 stone. And his helicopter wouldn't lift off the ground. So that was that, finished. There he was at. But with mine, it could. And I argued that Igor Sikorsky had done this himself. Somebody had got to fly a helicopter for the first time. Igor had done this. And I got up. And we put it out in the middle of the airfield, as far away from any building and human being as possible. And I was all over Speke Airfield for the best part of half an hour before we got some sort of control. I got it back to Farnborough and said, "I'm not touching that thing again until I have some instruction." But it worked out, not too bad. Yes?
Of all the aircraft that you flew, sir, did you fly Russian aircraft?
Yes, I did.
And how did they compare with...
Terrible. Yeah. In the war, bad. But there were two problems. The Russians built engines only for military use. And their philosophy was, no engine in a military aircraft, if it's worth its salt, is going to last more than 100 hours. And that's what they built for. And of course this caused them a lot of trouble when they went into civil thing, because their engines were unusable in civil aircraft. And the other thing was, at that time, they were very badly built. For example, the rivets were, where there were metal fuselages, and many of them were wooden, but the rivets were proud of the skin. In the cockpit, the instrumentation was utterly basic. There was no artificial horizon, there was only a turn and bank indicator, which is exceptionally crude. When you consider these guys were flying in dreadful weather and snow and everything in Russia, one has to take one's hat off to them. But then again, the Russians were, in the war, tactically naive. They really were. For example, they would fly the Ilyushin-2, which was the most produced aircraft in the world. They used to fly them in large formations like the Flying Fortresses, but they didn't have the firepower. In fact, they had one pea shooter at the back, and many of the pilots were women. And I spoke to Bobby Hartman, the world's top scorer, 352 victories. I talked to him after the war and I said, long after the war, because he was a prisoner in Russia for 10 years. When he got back, and he said, well, it was simple. He said, there was really no chance of being hit with these small guns they had. And he said, I didn't open fire until the whole airplane filled my windscreen. And he said, you could kill as many if you didn't fire too far back, you really got close up. He said, I could kill 7 in one sortie. So that's how they got these colossal scores. Now, if you take the biggest air battle that ever took place, ever in the world, was at Kursk in June 1943. And the German 109s and 190s were approaching the Russians of various types, Yaks, etc., various kinds of aircraft. And the conclusion of the battle was that the Russians lost 453 aircraft and the Germans lost 27. Gives you an idea against how tactically naive you were fighting against. At the end of the war, though, one has to say, they learned fast. And some of their aircraft I flew right after the capitulation, and they were just about up to speed. with the West by then. And of course, in Korea, the MiG-15, from all the Germans they've captured, they learned a lot about sweepback, etc. And the MiG-15 was just about up to the Sabre, not the Sabre E model, but the Sabre A, B, and C models. It was just about up to them.
Yes, I'm sure would like to hear that story, please.
Well, I didn't know Neil Armstrong at that time, but I was flying at RAeS Bedford. Our farmer, the men, they'd moved a lot up to Bedford. And it was over the lunchtime. And they'd arranged to send a jeep to pick me up. Neil Armstrong was unknown to me, was flying at the same time. And he was picked up at the same jeep. I had no idea who he was. We went down to the mess and we had lunch together because just two of us to talk. And it wasn't until we were halfway through this that I found out who he was. And I thought, well, I'd heard how anti the media he was because he'd got utterly fed up with everybody asking him how was it on the moon. So I thought I wouldn't even mention the moon. And I never did. But after a while he started talking about it. Very interesting because he said to me, "You've been very kind, you haven't asked me about the moon." He said, "You're the first person that I think hasn't." And he said, "So I'm going to tell you something I've never told anybody else." He said, "I was so affected by this," he said, "I am still not living a normal life." Because, he said, we looked down, and he said, "I'm not talking to myself. Every astronaut who's been on the moon has been affected in a similar way." And he said, "You look down, and you see a grain of sand down there, and that's the Earth. And you say to yourself, what have we done to be the chosen people? Can it really be that we are the only living creatures of our kind, intelligent creatures of our kind on Earth?" And he said, the other dreadful thought that crosses your mind is, will I ever get back there? And it is a very serious thought. And every one of them has had something. Now, Neil Armstrong today lives in Arizona, and his house is like Fort George. It's surrounded by barbed wire, and Neil's perfectly okay, but he has had the media up to here, and he is determined that he is going to try and live within his limits a normal life. Now, as you know, Buzz Aldrin was his co-pilot on that occasion, and Gene and I went to Los Angeles as guests for the Wright brothers celebration, and we were with 20 astronauts there for the whole week. And they all had dreadful stories to tell that they weren't allowed to tell the media. Because if the media told these to the public would start saying, "Halt this, these are far too risky," and they wouldn't get the funding for them. So they have to be very canny what they do. But Buzz Aldrin, to give you another example, after he landed with Neil, within a few weeks he vanished. And he went completely hippie. He vanished for 3 years, and his wife hadn't a clue where he was, and she spent those 3 years tracking him down and found him. And he said when we were there, we were sitting next table to him at the dinner there, that his wife saved him because he had lost his way. And basically the reason he described was the same reason that Neil had described. He couldn't, it wasn't within his human intellect to conceive how we in the universe were positioned with this situation, Earth with the only apparent intelligent life on. So it's, sometimes these things get to you. He was a Scotsman too, incidentally, of Scots descent. I should have given him some malt.
President Chris Hughes to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You really do like giving a challenge, don't you?
Yes.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, may I start this vote of thanks, first of all, with a very sincere thank you to the so many new faces that we have seen this evening. It's an absolute delight on behalf of Birmingham, Wolverhampton and Cosford to welcome you here and to hope that we will see so many of you again. I guess that those that have come more often will appreciate by now that I personally consider it a huge honour to be asked by the branch to propose a vote of thanks. It is something that I enjoy doing and take on the task willingly, despite the fact that this is probably the most challenging that our chairman's ever asked me to take. I think, if I may, I would like to start this thank you with a very small personal anecdote, and that is that whilst I consider the proposal of a vote of thanks an honour on behalf of the branch, there's a very personal element to this one, and there's absolutely no reason whatsoever why I should imagine that Captain Brown remembers this. But in his role as President of the Royal Aeronautical Society in 1983, he presented my Royal Aeronautical Society Alan Marsh Award, which was for the receipt of 5 hours of helicopter tuition whilst I was doing research at Westlands in Yeovil. If I remember rightly, that 5 hours in a Bell 47 G4A brought my total hours as P1 and PUT up to the staggering figure of about 39, and my total aircraft types ever flown up to 3. The point of the anecdote is simply to say, no matter what pretensions I may have had towards a flying career, absolutely no amount of experience whatsoever would have brought me anywhere close to being in a position where I was capable of proposing the vote of thanks this evening, qualified in any way at all, of proposing this evening's vote of thanks to such a character as Captain Eric Brown. One of the things I love about our aviation industry is that it throws up so many characters who have played significantly more than their own allotted role in our business and have so many fascinating stories to tell. One of the things I enjoy about our society is that it gives us the opportunity to enjoy those stories and to, if you like, relive the history of our business by listening to these characters. And probably Eric Brown is the most characterful of all of those that I have ever had personally the pleasure to have met. One of the things that our chairman did not say in the introduction is that Eric Brown was voted by the United States Navy as the single most accomplished naval aviator of all time. And I think at that point there really is not a lot more that I can say. Captain Brown personally, and on behalf of the local branch, it's a huge honour to have listened to you. You started your most entertaining presentation this evening with a slightly throwaway line that you would look forward to coming back and offering us a repeat lecture. I think on behalf of all of us, I'd like to say how much we look forward to it. Ladies and gentlemen, let's join in.